diner is on Market Street, and it stays open all night. It's 1975. You're at the counter after last call, and a man asks if he can sit down. He's polite. He has a pen in his hand, and while you talk, he starts drawing on a napkin. Animals, mostly. You know something about art. You can see that he's good. The line is confident. He isn't hesitating. He isn't fixing anything. He tells you he's studying to be a cartoonist. He asks if you like it. You go home with him. And at some point in that room, this man tries to kill you. You get out. You survive. You walk into the San Francisco Police Department and you tell them everything. The diner, the napkin, the animals, the art school, his face, his voice, and then they explain what happens next. To make a case, you'll have to say all of it again, in a courtroom, under your own name, in front of the city. You'll have to stand up in 1975 San Francisco and say out loud that you went home with a man. You think about your job. You think about your parents. You think about what the papers will print and what your landlord reads at breakfast. And you tell them no. There were at least 2 men who survived this killer. Police believe there were more, men who never came forward at all. Some of them chose silence, and that silence is the reason that 51 years later, this man has never spent a single day in a cell. The San Francisco Police Department still has an open file on him. There's a standing reward of $250,000 for his name. Nobody has ever collected it. They call him the Doodler. Every man in this video is, as far as any law enforcement agency in the United States is aware, alive right now. Not in prison, not in the ground. Alive, with a driver's license and a grocery list and a chair he likes to sit in. That isn't speculation. In most of these cases, it's the official position of the agency still working the file. We're going to do this in 2 halves. First, the men who were never caught. Killers who stopped or vanished and left investigators with a sketch, a caliber, and nothing else. Then, in the back half, the one that may never have stopped at all, a case where the bodies are recent enough that some of you watching have driven past the street. And there's one more thing, which I'm going to tell you now so you can watch for it. Every single man in this video escaped for the same reason. It is not the reason you think it is. Between January of 1974 and June of 1975, 6 men were murdered in San Francisco. The first was Gerald Kavanaugh. He was 49 years old, and he was found on Ocean Beach on the 27th of January, 1974. The second was Joseph Stevens. Everyone called him Jay. He was 27. He performed as a female impersonator in the city's clubs. And on the 25th of June, 1974, they found him near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. He had been stabbed in the chest and in the back. The last one investigators connected to the case was Warren Andrews. In April of 1975, he was attacked at Land's End on the cliffs at the western edge of the city. He was found unconscious. He never woke up. He died weeks later without ever telling anyone what happened to him. The method almost never varied. The Doodler met his victims in the bars and clubs and all-night diners of the Castro and Polk Gulch. He was sociable. He was funny. He drew. Then he went home with them, and then, afterward, he used a knife. The wounds concentrated in the upper chest and the back, and he left the bodies outdoors on the western edge of San Francisco. Ocean Beach, Lincoln Park, Land's End, places where the fog comes in off the Pacific and sits on the ground until morning. Here is what makes this case different from every other case in this video. The police knew who he was. The San Francisco Police Department identified a suspect. They interviewed him, and they could not charge him because a prosecution needed the survivors, and the survivors would not go on the record. You have to understand what they were being asked to do. In 1975, in most of this country, being publicly identified as a gay man could cost you your apartment, your job, your children, and your family. And they were being asked to do it by a police department that the neighborhood did not trust and had no reason to. Meanwhile, the city's investigators were buried. 1974 and 75 in San Francisco was the Zodiac, the Zebra murders, and the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. 6 dead gay men did not compete for resources, and everyone involved knew it. In January of 2023, the SFPD released an age progression sketch, a drawing of what he would look like now, and raised the reward to $250,000. If he was in his 20s in 1974, he is in his 70s today. He may be dead. The department does not assume that. Honolulu had never had a case like this, not once in the history of the state. Between May of 1985 and the spring of the following year, 5 women were murdered on the island of Oahu. Vicky Purdy was 25. Her husband flew Army helicopters, and she had spent most of her life wanting to live in Hawaii. She was reported missing after a night out with friends, and her body was found near Kihei Lagoon. Denise Hughes was 21. She was a secretary at a telephone company. She was active in her church, and she took the bus to work every day. She never arrived. Louise Medeiros was 25. She flew back from visiting her family on Kauai, and she was last seen at a bus stop at the Honolulu airport. Road workers found her under a freeway overpass. Linda Pesce was 36. Her roommate reported her missing in April of 1986. Her car was found abandoned on the shoulder of Nimitz Highway. The 5th victim was a 17-year-old high school student named Regina Sakamoto. She missed her bus. Every one of them was strangled. Every one of them was found with her hands bound behind her back. And every one of them was left near water. A lagoon, a stream, a channel, the edge of Sand Island. That's the signature, and it's the whole file. 5 women, 1 method, no weapon, no witness, and a task force that eventually pulled in the FBI and still came up with nothing they could use. Investigators did have a primary suspect. He failed a polygraph. They could not build a case around him, and no one was ever charged. And then, this is the part that has bothered every detective who has ever touched this case. The killing simply stopped. After April of 1986, it never happened again. Not on Oahu, not anywhere in the state. 40 years later, the file is technically open and practically frozen. The Honolulu Strangler remains the only serial murder series in Hawaiian history, and no one has ever been arrested for a single one of them. Frankfurt is a working neighborhood in the northeast of Philadelphia, and in the 1980s, the elevated train ran right down the middle of it, over a long row of bars on Frankfurt Avenue. In August of 1985, a 52-year-old woman named Helen Parent was found dead near that avenue. She had been stabbed 19 times. Over the next 5 years, at least 8 women died the same way, all of them within a few blocks of the same street. All of them had been stabbed. Most of them had last been seen drinking in one of the bars along the avenue. An attorney with the Innocence Project of Pennsylvania later described the victims in a single sentence that should be carved into the wall of that police station. They were all local. They all had histories of mental illness or drug dependency. They were women, she said, on the edges of society. Witnesses kept describing the same person. a middle-aged white man seen drinking with the women shortly before they died. Police put out a composite sketch. Nobody came forward. Then, in April of 1990, a 46-year-old woman named Carol Dowd was found in an alley behind a fish market. And Philadelphia made an arrest. The man they arrested was named Leonard Christopher. He was 39 years old. He was black, and he worked at that fish market. He did not match the description that every witness in the case had given. There was no murder weapon. There was no blood. There was no physical evidence linking him to Carol Dowd, and there was nothing at all linking him to the other 7 women. The prosecution never offered a motive. On the 12th of December, 1990, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and a judge sentenced him to life. He said he was innocent from the first day to the last. He died behind bars. Now here is the fact that ends the argument. On the 6th of September, 1990, a 30-year-old woman named Michelle Denner was stabbed to death in her apartment. She had last been seen with a middle-aged white man in a bar on Frankfurt Avenue. Leonard Christopher was already in a cell. 8 of those cases have never been closed. Philadelphia police have re-examined the DNA. The department will not discuss it. The man the witnesses described has never been identified, and the last time anyone saw him, he was buying a woman a drink. New Bedford, Massachusetts is an old whaling port, and in the spring of 1988, it had a heroin problem concentrated in a few blocks around a place called Weld Square. That March, women started disappearing. 11 of them over roughly a year. 9 were eventually found. 2 never were. The first body turned up on the 2nd of July, 1988, off Route 140. Her name was Deborah Medeiros. She was 30. After that, they came steadily, off Interstate 195, off Route 88, in Dartmouth, in Westport, in Freetown, near on-ramps, in gravel pits, in the tree line, 20 feet from cars doing 65 miles an hour. Nancy Paiva was 36 years old, and she had 2 daughters, 13 and 17. She was last seen leaving a bar. When her sister didn't hear from her for a couple of weeks, she knew. She said she just knew. Nancy's body was found 3 weeks later off Interstate 195 in Dartmouth. It was Nancy Paiva's case that broke the pattern open. A New Bedford detective working her murder started pulling the missing persons reports, laid them next to each other, and understood what he was looking at. The last one was Sandra Botelho. She was 25, she had been missing for over a year, and she was found on the 24th of April, 1989, beside Interstate 195 near Marion. The 2 who were never found were Christina Montero, who was 19, and Marilyn Roberts, who was 34. Marilyn's father was a retired New Bedford police officer. He reported his own daughter missing twice, once in June of 1988, and again in December, after he heard there might be a serial killer working his city. Every one of these women struggled with addiction. Several of them worked the streets around Weld Square, and that is precisely why, for months, nobody counted them. A woman with a habit who stopped showing up is filed as a woman who left. One man was ever arrested in the New Bedford killings, a local attorney. The charge was dropped. He was never tried, and he later died. The Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit still works the file. 38 years on, they have never named the killer, and 9 women are still waiting for someone to. In the spring of 1992, a man drove into the middle of the country and killed 6 people in 30 days. On the 8th of April in Indianapolis, he walked into a Payless shoe store. The manager was working alone. Her name was Robin Fuldauer. She was 26 years old, and she had been running that store for a matter of weeks. 3 days later, in Wichita, Kansas, he walked into a bridal shop and killed 2 women, Patricia Magers, who was 32, and Patricia Smith, who was 24. Investigators believe he expected to find 1 clerk alone, and found 2. It is the only time in the entire case that he killed more than 1 person, and the only time he ever improvised. On the 27th of April, in Terre Haute, Indiana, he walked into a ceramics shop owned by a family and killed a 40-year-old man named Michael McCown. Everyone called him Mick. He had long, dark hair. Investigators have always believed that from behind, through a shop window, the killer mistook him for a woman. On the 3rd of May, in St. Charles, Missouri, he killed Nancy Kitzmiller in a shoe store. She was 24. 4 days after that, in Raytown, Missouri, he walked into a gift shop and killed Sarah Blessing. She was 37. Witnesses outside saw a man leave the store and walk up the embankment toward the interstate. That interstate is I-70. Every one of these stores was within a few miles of it, and that is where the name comes from. The method never changed. He picked small specialty shops, shoes, dresses, ceramics, gifts. He came in daylight, in the middle of the day, when a store like that has 1 person in it. He asked the clerk to find something for him in the back. He followed her. 1 shot, small caliber, to the back of the head. And then he left, and he never took anything. Not the register, not a purse. Nothing was ever missing from a single scene. The gun was uncommon, a small imported .22, and ballistics tied the scenes together across 4 states, which is how a fragmented set of local homicides became one man. He didn't stop in Missouri. In 1993, in Texas, 2 women were shot in stores under conditions that matched: Mary Ann Glasscock in Fort Worth and Amy Vess in Arlington. In 1994, in Houston, a 35-year-old woman named Vicki Webb was shot in the same circumstances. She lived. And then, in 2001, he appears to have surfaced one final time in Terre Haute, the same city as 1992, in the killing of a store clerk named Billy Brossman. And this time, there was a security camera. There is clean video footage of the man investigators believe is the I-70 killer. It has been broadcast on national television. Nobody has ever identified him. The description has never changed in 34 years. A white man, 5'7" to 5'9", slim, in his 20s or 30s at the time, with light or reddish-brown hair. In 2021, detectives from Indianapolis, Wichita, Terre Haute, St. Charles, and Raytown sat down in one room with federal investigators, the first time every agency in the case had ever compared its files directly. The following year, they sent evidence out for DNA testing. The DNA has not matched anyone. The shell casings are the last hope they have. And now I have to tell you what happened this year. In July of 2026, a journalist named Bob Cyphers, who has covered this case since 1992 and published a book on it in 2024, said publicly that police had brought a man in earlier that spring. They sat him down. They told him to his face that they believed he was the I-70 killer. He told them to charge him, or he was leaving. And then he stood up and walked out of the building. According to Cyphers, investigators are now, in his words, camping out. They have their eyes on somebody. They believe it's him. In an earlier phase of the case, Terre Haute police had already drawn up a murder warrant on a suspect, and the prosecutor refused to sign it. So understand exactly what this is. He is not hiding. He is not a mystery. He is a man with an address and a routine, and apparently, a very clear understanding of the American rules of evidence. They know where he is. They cannot touch him. And he knows both of those things. If he was in his 20s in 1992, he is in his mid-50s now. If he was in his 30s, he is in his 70s. The tip line has been open since before some of you were born. Now, the thing I told you to watch for. Go back and look at who these men chose. A gay man in 1974, in a country where reporting the attack meant destroying your own life to do it. Women alone at bus stops in Honolulu. Women in Frankfurt with histories of addiction and mental illness. Women the case file itself describes as being on the edges of society. Women in New Bedford whose disappearances were filed as women who had wandered off. These men were not geniuses. Almost none of them did anything clever. One of them walked into a store in broad daylight and asked for help finding a shoe. They chose people that America had already decided not to look for. And they were right. That is the method. Everything else is just logistics. Which brings us to the second half of this video, and the one case where it may still be happening. In 2017, a man named Thomas Hargrove ran an algorithm. Hargrove is a former investigative reporter who runs a nonprofit called the Murder Accountability Project. What it does is simple. It takes the FBI's national homicide data and looks for clusters, places where a particular kind of killing happens far more often than it statistically should, and gets solved far less often than it should. The algorithm flagged Chicago. In January of 2018, the Chicago Tribune went and checked by hand, pulling police records and Cook County medical examiner files, and arrived at the same number Hargrove had. 51 women, strangled or asphyxiated, between 2001 and 2018, all unsolved. Angela Ford was 32. She was found on the 4th of January, 2001. Charlotte Day was 42. Winifred Shines was 33. Brenda Cowart was 52. Saudia Banks was 39. Bessie Scott was 43. Shaniqua Williams was found in an alley in Bronzeville on the 30th of December, 2005. Most of them were black. Many of them were sex workers. Nearly all of them were found outdoors, in alleys, in vacant lots, in abandoned buildings on the south and west sides of the city. In 2019, under public pressure, the Chicago Police Department assigned 6 detectives to review the cases alongside the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force. And the department stated publicly that there was no evidence any of it was the work of a serial killer. Then the DNA came back. Out of roughly 50 cases, only 18 produced any usable DNA at all. 21 samples in total. None of them match each other. None of them match anyone in the FBI's database. Hargrove's response to that is the most disturbing sentence in this entire story. Strangulation, he pointed out, is the most physically intimate way there is to kill a person. You are holding on to them the entire time. For 50 such murders to produce almost no recoverable DNA is not normal. That is not a result. That is a question. And so Chicago is left with 2 possibilities, and you should sit with both of them. Either one man has been strangling women in that city for 20 years, and nobody has stopped him, or 51 women were strangled in a single American city, and nobody ever found out who did it. One of those is true. There is no third option, and neither of the two is survivable if you live there. There's a map. In 2004, FBI analysts noticed something along Interstate 40 in the stretch running through Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Women's bodies left near the road. Same victim profile. Different police departments, none of whom were talking to each other. So the Bureau built a database and called it the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. It now contains more than 850 murders. It contains roughly 450 potential suspects, and the overwhelming majority of those names belong to long-haul truck drivers. About 200 of those cases are still open. Frank Figliuzzi, who retired as an assistant director of the FBI, explained the mechanics of it in a book 2 years ago. A tractor-trailer, he said, is a mobile crime scene. You take her in one jurisdiction, you kill her in the second, you leave her in the third. No police department ever sees the shape of it, because no department has more than one piece. And to be very clear, because it matters, there are millions of long-haul drivers in this country, and almost every one of them is exactly what he appears to be. Someone doing an exhausting job so that the rest of us can buy things. The database is a rounding error against that number, but it is a rounding error with 450 names in it. Tonight we covered 6 cases. 6. The map has 850 dots. Somewhere out there tonight, a man on that map is doing something completely ordinary. Buying gas, watching television, falling asleep. Nobody is looking for him. That was always the plan.